Okay, everyone, welcome to this webinar, and it's good to see you again. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Info Voices. And in this webinar, we're going to look at a subject we've looked at over many times, and that's climate change. Now, climate change is a subject that people feel either strongly or even mildly about, but there are some people who believe that it's such an emergency that we really have to take action now. If we don't take action now, if we don't start addressing the problem now, then we all face a dire future. And we've got Alison Teal with us today, who has taken action and is an activist. And so really pleased that she's joined us today. And we're going to, interview Alison about the emergency of climate change. So Alison, thank you for joining us today. And perhaps you could first start just by telling us very briefly a little about yourself.
Sure, yeah, so I first came into contact with the seriousness of the climate emergency when I was living in Australia, and did some research in the early 90s looking at how people felt about the climate crisis and what they were doing. And I found that a lot of people were already doing things like recycling and reusing grey water and all those sorts of things. And so since that time, I've been certainly very concerned about it. Had children after that experience, became even more concerned about it. And when my children were old enough, I decided, okay, this is something I've really got to focus on. And so for the last, 5-6 years, I've been pretty much dedicating myself to doing all I can to help get people to wake up to the realities of what we're facing.
And when you did decide to get involved, you really did it with a vengeance, didn't you? Because you actually got involved in the tree protest in Sheffield and faced, being arrested and imprisonment, and an injunction was served on you by Sheffield Council. Tell us about that.
Gosh, so I got involved with the tree campaign in 2015. And it was just absolutely astonishing to find that the council thought it was a good idea to fell trees, mature trees, and replace them with saplings. And that they said that we found out subsequently that they wanted to do half of the city's trees. That was 17,500 trees they intended to fell. So it was so shocking that a lot of us felt that we needed to get together and do something. So we started standing under trees and preventing arborists from felling the trees, and made ourselves a real nuisance, and they had to keep going away, and there was lots of cat and mouse business going on around the city, and ultimately they got so tired of it that they started to arrest people. So I was in the group, the second group of people to be arrested in February 2017. There were 7 of us sitting under a chestnut tree. And the police had been brought in, got involved, and they arrested us all under anti-trade union legislation for interfering with a workman and his tools. And this is the Labour Council, which made it all the more astonishing. And so we got taken to a police station and were all put in individual cells. And I was kept there for 8 hours and 41 minutes, it says on my charge sheet, just for sitting under a tree. So it's quite astonishing. And then following that, we still found ways to get under trees, despite the threat of arrest. And so the council got itself a High Court injunction. And several of us were named personally on that. And then that was in the July. And then in September, I was served notice that I had breached the injunction on 2 counts, supposedly, and I was taken to the High Court facing the potential of committal or serious fines. But thankfully, the judge agreed with me that their way of seeing things was incorrect. He dismissed the case, and yes, the council had to pay my barrister costs and their own costs as well. So what a great relief it was not to be, to have been found not to have breached the injunction.
Well, clearly in your actions, you demonstrate that you think the environment is absolutely important and that climate change is really the crucial issue facing us. And you were willing to face imprisonment. The problem is that recent public opinion polls have shown that the UK, probably more than any other country, is deeply concerned about climate change, but they are not willing to turn that concern into action. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a lot to do with the government, and they say things, but they're not very strongly from governments and local government too to respond to the climate crisis. It's all rather sort of little bits here and there. I mean, look at the Warm Homes grant. You know, the plant, they had all this money that they were going to put towards insulating homes, but it was managed very poorly, and only a tiny percentage of the money was spent. And you know, most people didn't even get to know about it, and so you know, they're not being exactly efficient or effective. And so I think that it's easy for people to get lulled into a false sense of security and think, well, the government aren't acting like it's a great big emergency, so why should I worry? But I do think things like David Attenborough and you know, school strikes, Fridays for a Future, those things have made an impact, and XR certainly has made a big impact. So people know, but there is this, we have this tremendous capacity as humans, don't we, to have this cognitive dissonance where we know facts, but we don't act on them. And so you know, that's certainly part of Rupert Read's, a lot of the work he's doing right now is looking at how do we get people to act.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Rupert Read, and he's a professor and has been very active in this. And he started the Green Climate Activist Network, hasn't he? And was that a way of trying to move people from the sofa to, you know, the streets, from concern to action? Was it a way of telling people, wake up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we started this group that's you know, gradually expanding, and we're hoping that it will get considerably bigger. And it's not a party political group. It's a group that's meant to attract people who are concerned about the environment and want to have an opportunity to group with to get together with other people to actually carry out actions which are distinctive from XR in that there won't be any intention to get arrested. It's more about raising the profile of issues. And you know, so if you've got, say, plans to have an incinerator close to you or something like that, it's about helping people mobilize and work together to draw attention to the dangers and why these things are really bad ideas. So that's something that we're really trying to push now, and creating more actions and providing information about things. So when activists want to call up the local radio or try and attract TV media attention, that they'll have all the facts and figures to hand and feel more confident about speaking about things. So it's providing all this information, providing ideas, and also creating a forum to generate bigger plans for example, the COP26 in Glasgow.
Well, I mean, the incinerator is certainly a big issue in our area, but there are many other issues as well. I mean, a number of people have said that we've only got 10 years to make a difference. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, said in the USA, 9 years. And Anglia Ruskin University has done some research, I think, that suggests that society will collapse in 3 decades because of catastrophic food shortages. I mean, how do you see the seriousness of climate change?
There is no other issue, is there? I mean, it supersedes everything because it has an existential threat. And, you know, we know that, you know, the serious impact on biodiversity, you know, the loss of species, you know, the erosion of soils, the depletion of nutrients in soils. I mean, it's very, like, nothing is more serious than this. And yet, you know, the world leaders, it's great to hear what you just said about what John Kerry said, but we need so much more of that. And the frustration for me is, you know, and many other people that I know who are really involved in this, is that we've known this for decades. You know, I mean, Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore, you know, how long ago is that now? And, you know, it's just so frustrating that we've had to get to almost the 12th hour before we're actually seeing people starting to really understand and appreciate what we're actually facing. And so, you know, it can really get you down. And so I just have to really hold on to a bit of optimism that we still have a chance. We still have a chance to change things, but it's very important that people hear more about it all the time. And the Sky News efforts is really good. You know, the 15-minute slot they're doing on climate crisis now, like that, things like that encourage me and give me hope. So
we posted about the Sky News initiative, which is really great. I mean, so do you think with the momentum that's happening, do we have to change personal behavior or government behavior or international organizational behavior, or all of it?
We certainly have to do all of it, but I think most important is the government, and getting the government to understand that the people really, really need them to take leadership on that. And, you know, like so COP26, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, the fact that big polluters will be allowed to attend potentially, you know, that will actually have fossil fuel companies lobbying politicians during that time is absolutely extraordinary. And that's the sort of thing we've got to lobby against and say, look, you know, you stopped tobacco companies having an influence within the UN. We need to stop fossil fuel companies having an influence. We need to make it very clear that there's this massive contradiction here. You know, it's just not acceptable to enable the big polluters to continue to spread false information. And so, you know, I'm on the board for South Yorkshire Pensions Authority, and we've been lobbying really hard on that board to get them to divest from fossil fuel companies, and it's really hard to persuade them, because, you know, the money is just so, you know, it's been such a boon, hasn't it? You know, it's been a sure way of being able to sustain pensions and what have you, and convincing, you know, the money managers, the investors, that look, you know, there are alternatives, and we can show examples of pension funds that have divested and are still being really successful, you know, and the importance of putting their considerable you know, forces, financial resources behind renewables and stuff. These sorts of things can make such a massive difference, and so that's what we're advocating for. We need people to understand, to be less afraid of making a bold change. We don't have a choice, you know, we have to be really courageous about this.
Yeah, I mean, lots of local authorities are still investing in fossil fuels, and so it's a really big problem to get them to move because they're afraid. But people like Rupert Read, for example, believes that we've got to take even more drastic changes. We've got to do some specific things. You mentioned that companies are involved, fossil fuel companies are involved in COP26 in November. But, you know, it's getting citizens involved as well at that meeting, so their views are heard. And Rupert says we really have to do three things. And one of them is we have to set up a citizens' assembly. Now, we've heard that a great deal, and many of them are, you know, they don't achieve a lot. They don't result in action. But he believes we need a national citizens' assembly, doesn't he? Maybe you can tell us about that, because he thinks they should have constitutional powers to make decisions over and above Parliament. Now, that sounds incredible. I mean, how do you choose that citizens' assembly? If you make it representatives, you might get a lot of skeptics on it. So it's a bit of a dangerous path, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you probably use the sortition method, similar to like jury service. And of course, they wouldn't be going in blind. So even if you should have some skeptics there, but the idea is that you have scientists and people who can give the latest information to that citizens' assembly so that they're well informed in order to make these decisions. And the idea is that because MPs have been so appallingly bad at, you know, showing leadership in this area, that they essentially give over their authority to make the decisions to the Citizens' Assembly and be bound by the conclusions that the Citizens' Assembly reaches. And he also suggests guardians for a future, the idea of having a panel that is also above Parliament, that essentially is there to oversee decision-making processes with a view to the future. So the idea of thinking sort of 8-10 generations ahead for every decision. How is this decision going to impact on those generations in the future? And so having that sort of role, I think, is really important. And the other thing he says is that we really need to adopt the precautionary principle, which is absolutely vital and was first mooted, I think, in the Rio summit in 1992. So this has got a long history, and the idea is that, you know, we need to not have to insist on having full scientific information before we take action. And the COVID pandemic has been a brilliant example of what a difference a precautionary principle can make. If you compare New Zealand, made preventative measures that have enabled them to now, after a year of the pandemic, there've been 26 people lost their lives in New Zealand because who didn't act and waited to get more scientific information before they made decisions. And they've got, you know, we have something like 127,000 deaths now. So the comparison, the contrast between the precautionary principle and not, if you think about that in terms of the number of lives we could save, the amazing differences we can make to our society if we act in this way will be incredibly significant.
I mean, I think you explained the precautionary principle very well, and lots of people have argued that for lots of things. But the Citizens' Assembly and the Guardians for Future Generations, people will find quite surprising. I mean, Citizens' Assemblies, for example, yes, we like them, but what if, you know, you do it by sortition, you know, by almost choosing by chance, and they come up with a decision you don't like that's not, you know, activist enough? Where do we go from there?
You're making an assumption about something that hasn't happened.
You sound like a politician when you say that.
I would find it very hard to be, well, you know, the decisions that have been made so far by citizens' assemblies, that they might be a little bit erring on the conservative side. I accept that, but in general, they don't come with sort of skeptics outcomes, do they? They do allow themselves to be persuaded by the information, and the information is utterly compelling. You know, that the science is indisputable now, and so there is really no way of avoiding that truth. I mean, it's there. It's about the implications of the truth, isn't it? And whether or not people are willing to, well, I mean, essentially we'll be facing the potential for a lower standard of living here, for example. We might have less choices about the things that we consume, etc. But that's balanced out by other benefits, isn't it? We'll have cleaner air, we'll have, you know, a healthier environment, we'll have more green space, and, you know, potentially a lot more time as well, because we don't need to manufacture so much, we don't need to consume so much, so it frees up time for other things. And so, you know, everything's got its positives and negatives, hasn't it? And
yeah, but that, I suppose that doesn't answer the question. What would you do if they came up with the wrong decision?
Cross that bridge when we come to it. I mean, I guess, you know, if you think about, if you had the Guardians for the Future as well as part of that structure, yeah, if that was an agreeable part of it, and you've got a panel of people who are overseeing all decision making in terms of how is this going to impact on future generations, then that would be an additional protective mechanism.
But the Guardians of the Future, I mean, that's sort of very interesting as well, isn't it? Because you're sort of superimposing that on the top of Parliament. So in a way, you're undermining the democratic process. How would you choose these guardians? They sound like Plato's philosopher kings. They sound like, you know, the elders that were appointed by the United Nations, so they didn't have, you know, powers that they could impose. I mean, it sounds like you're setting up an elitist dictatorial body over Parliament. So it's a bit confusing as to how they would operate if Parliament can't hold them to account.
Well, I believe, yeah, the idea is that Rupert has said that they would be democratically elected there. Whether that would be, I'm not actually sure if he's gone into great detail about it, but yeah, there certainly would be a democratic process in selecting those people. Certainly
there is a real problem about future generations, and there's an all-party parliamentary group that's looking at that, and I don't know to what extent they've looked at climate change. I don't think they have a lot, but they should. But are you confident, are you, that that if you have a citizens' assemblies and, future generation panel over and above Parliament, they will come to the right decisions. I mean, we know Parliament is in many ways not as reliable as we would like it to be in making long-term decisions. We do have to face a problem of what do we do about, a Parliament that only looks 5 years at a time. But are you certain that you've got the right structures to overcome that?
Well, yeah, this is like Rupert's, a very clever man, and I think he's got a good idea there. But with all good ideas, more minds make for even better solutions, don't they? And so this is the starting point. These ideas are a sketched version of this is how it could be. But I imagine the actual end point, once there's been more discussion and debate, that we will find perhaps something a little different than what he suggested. But I do think that it is a good way forward because, I mean, we know that currently our parliament is not at all democratic, and we have a very, very problematic electoral system. First past the post is also, we don't end up with a representative government at all. And so, I think that these things need to be looked at. But the problem with all of that is we don't have time. We've got 9 years, 10 years in order to bring about massive shift. I mean, and it's absolutely overwhelming. And so we do need some sort of simplified process. And so I think that the proposal of Citizens' Assembly and the sort of a Guardians of the Future panel does enable us to get on with it, if you like. It would enable us to make much swifter action than trying to, for years the Green Party have been lobbying, haven't they, for change, and so have, Make Votes Matter. There's been lots of organisations that are trying to change the electoral process that would enable a more representative democracy, and essentially it's been failing. It hasn't worked so far because there was a lot of vested interest in the current system, and the short-termism of the way liberal democracy works has brought us to this place. We're in this crisis because of those imperfect systems.
Rupert also argues that one country can't go it alone, can't in climate change. Everyone has to be involved. But there's a problem there when so many countries have authoritarian regimes that will dampen down on protest. How do you get the global movement? Even if you get everything you want in the United Kingdom, you've got a world to face. How do you deal with that?
Well, yeah, I'm a big one for think global, act local. So we can only manage what we have within our remit, can't we? And by doing the best that we can, I suppose there's a potential there to set an example, which can then, you can't go telling other countries what to do if you're complete hypocrites and not doing it yourself. And so I think it's really important to start at home, get things right here, and then hope to have an influence globally. But hopefully that's happening all across the globe. In terms of XR, that's gone global, and so has the school strikes. I mean, it started in Sweden with Greta Thunberg, and so that potential is there. And I guess it's very much the idea of trying to influence China and India. I mean, how can we? Because we are responsible for Britain has led the way in terms of being a colonial and imperial power, responsible for a tremendous amount of the devastation that's occurring now because of our behaviour in the past and continuing behaviour as well. And so we've really got to get our own house in order before we could have any expectation of having any kind of moral influence over what other countries are doing. And I think that's a massive enough task for us to be dealing with.
But aren't you afraid? I mean, what we've seen with COVID is it began as an international thing, and then we had sort of, vaccine nationalism beginning to emerge. And won't we see that with climate change as well? We'll get sort of climate change nationalism. Russia saying, look, by telling us to stop selling our gas, you're telling us to stop our basic resource that makes our country go, and they won't do it. How do we tackle that problem?
I guess by coming up with the solutions and providing the alternatives and the technology. And, I can imagine, a time where a lot of the technology, sort of the patent system and the way companies make money, that's going to have to change, isn't it? We're going to have open source information. We're going to have to share a lot of our intellectual property to enable other countries to adopt those alternative technologies. We can't, the whole profit motive, the whole way that the system works at the moment is leading to our environmental catastrophe. And so that's why what we mean by system change is all these things have to be dealt with in a very, very different way. We can't tweak the current model and expect to be able to prevent biodiversity loss and climate change from continuing, and global warming to continue. That it cannot be. It all has to be integral. It all has to work together, and that's why it is so extraordinarily daunting. But we have to make our best efforts, don't we? We have to try. That's the important part. We do that.
So are you one of those people who believe, for example, that because the West historically have been the greatest polluters, and the UK has been the greatest polluter of all historically, because we began industrializing earlier, that we have a bigger responsibility, and we have to help the developed world by finance in a way that we haven't yet conceived? How important is that?
Vital. Yeah, we really have to own that responsibility for the devastation for a lot of people. Okay, so
you agree with that, and I think a lot of people would as well. Jonathan Porritt has written a book called Hope and Hell. He argues we only have 10 years to make a difference as well. And he says we are living in hell. We're going to live in even a worse hell as the years go by, and many countries are going to completely disappear. But he says there is hope. Now, with all those insurmountable problems we've talked about in this interview, the problems of setting up the structures that Rupert wants to do, the problem of global issues, the problem of authoritarian powers, the problems of economic nationalism, are you optimistic? Do you have hope, or are you skeptical?
Well, just let me plug Rupert's book, Parents for a Future. And I think this is a brilliant idea. So the idea is that we've had the children, somewhat shamefully, having to come out and say, please, adults, please do something about this crisis. And this is Rupert's response to it, that all those parents of all those children who are facing this catastrophic future, this really frightening future, if they get behind this, if they wake up and realize that, hang on, our children are facing a lifetime of potentially, they will, rather than die of old age, they might die of starvation. When you really start to face these terrifying potentials that what the future might hold for our children, it really, really does, really affects your heart. It really affects you emotionally. And that's the sort of, it's not about driving fear, it's about driving hope. We want people to have hope for the future, hope for their children. And the only way that they can have that realistically is to take action now. And so I think it's just vital that it's about awakening the feelings of parents and anyone who is associated, has children that they care about, nieces, nephews, whatever, when they understand the reality of the crisis that we face, that they will want to take action. And I think that that's a really brilliant idea of how we get to mobilize people, is looking at your children, look your children in the eye and say to them, I'm doing everything I possibly can to fix this, to make your future a healthier, greener one, a better one, perhaps even than what we have now. As Jonathan Porritt says, it's already hell. We can actually make it better. We can actually make the world a lot better. We don't have to keep going on the track that we're on. And I think that the inspiration of doing this for our children is a really powerful one.
Okay, well, we've sort of come to the end of our 30 minutes now. And if anybody wanted to know more about what you do, more about what Rupert has worked on in his ideas and what he's written and so on, how do they make contact with you or the Green Activist Network that you've set up?
Yep, so there's a website, which is www.greenscan. So if you just type in Greens, capital CAN, it should come up. That will work. And also there's a Parents for a Future website as well. And so you can just type in Parents for a Future, I think it's .org. and that will come up as well. I'm sure that the search engines will make it quite possible to find that information there. And yes, you'd be very, very welcome to join Greens Can and get involved in. We sort of have little people's assemblies and things. We're starting to do that, having discussions online, discussing, you know, what actions can we take, and it'd be really, really great to have more people on board, and more, you know, more minds makes for better ideas. So be most welcome to get engaged with those things.
Okay, well, you know, thanks for doing that. I mean, I asked some difficult questions because I think the real problem is we know what the problem is, but how you overcome it, everyone's struggling with. We come up with new ideas, we come up with new structures. There are always counter arguments to that, and so we're sort of learning as we go. And it's a really difficult journey for all of us. There's no certainty in it, and uncertainty is the nature of the game for our future in a way, and we've got to learn to live with that. And I think you've raised those issues really well. You've talked about some of the solutions that need to be discussed and need to be talked about, and I think people will be interested in that, and they will have their own ideas as well. So, you know, thanks for doing that, and thanks for taking part in it, because I think you've contributed considerably to the discussion that we all must have now. So thanks for doing it, Alison. And, you know, we'll end this interview now.